Thank you everyone for joining us today at the Polariton Chemistry webinar series. I'm Sindhana and I am a graduate student at UC San Diego in the group of Professor Joel Yuenzao. I'm honored to host today's speaker, Professor Jonathan Keeling from the University of St. Andrews. Before we begin with the speaker's talk, I would like to share some information about the schedule and mechanics of the webinar. Starting this month, we will be holding monthly webinars at 9 a.m. Pacific time. And we'll announce the schedule for the upcoming webinars on Twitter soon, so stay tuned. And you need to register for each of these webinars at this link. If you haven't already, please join the Polariton Chemistry online community, which is a public Facebook group where you can post about papers, conferences, job openings, and more related to Polariton chemistry. And we also have a YouTube channel where we post the recordings of these webinars. So if you ever want to watch them again, you can watch them on YouTube. Now on to the mechanics. During the talk, you can use the raise hand button to ask questions. Once you click on the raise hand button, I will notify the speaker and you can ask your question. You can also use the chat to start discussions with other participants and post written questions in the Q&A. Without further delay, let me introduce today's speaker. Jonathan Keeling is a reader in theoretical condensed matter physics in the Scottish Universities Physics Alliance at the University of St. Andrews. Previously, he held an EPSRC Career Acceleration Fellowship, first in Cambridge and then in St. Andrews. Prior to that, he was a research fellow at Pembroke College, Cambridge, and a Lindman Fellow at MIT. He did his undergraduate and graduate degrees at the University of Cambridge, and he has worked extensively on exciton-polariton condensation and on many-body physics with light. Recently, he has worked on the physics of polaritons in organic materials, gold atoms in optical cavities, and numerical methods for modeling complex open quantum systems. With that being said, I pass the microphone and screen to Professor Jonathan Keeling.
Thank you very much. I'll just share screen. Is that visible?
Yes.
Great. So thank you very much for that introduction. And I should say thank you both for the invitation to speak in this series, and thank you for organizing this excellent series of seminars on polaritonic chemistry. What I want to do in this seminar is to talk about the challenges of modeling molecular polaritons or organic polariton physics, and in particular to show how this connects to a general question of modeling realistic open quantum systems. And so my broad aim for this seminar is to talk about that challenge, talk about how it relates to open quantum systems, to tell you one approach we have recently developed for that, which I will describe in some detail later, the time evolving matrix product operator algorithm, as a way of modeling non-Markovian open quantum systems. And then at the end to get on to tell you how we can apply that numerical method to problems involving molecular polaritons. And I want to do this partly just to discuss the physics of theoretical modeling of these problems and to say how this numerical method may be applied. But I also want to do this particularly as an advert for this tempo algorithm. We have made the code of this publicly available through this GitHub link. If you can't find it after the seminar, please feel free to get in touch. We're very keen to see as many possible uses of this as possible, either as collaborations with us or as people just using this code independently. And so part of my aim today is really to advertise the possibilities that come from the kind of approaches to modeling non-Markovian systems that I'll discuss, hopefully inspiring people to do other things with this approach. So with that said, let me start by talking about why I think there is an interesting and worthwhile challenge in trying to understand ways of modeling polaritonic physics with organic molecules. And what I think makes this interesting as a theory problem is that you need to combine a number of elements. You need to combine a description of the photophysics of molecules, so of vibrational progressions and of complicated line shapes, along with the physics of strong light matter coupling, along with the fact that this is not a problem of one molecule in a cavity, but is a problem of many molecules, significant numbers, where you can't really get away with very simple approaches, and where this is an open system with pumping and dissipation and cavity loss. And so I think that the fact that you have to combine all of these ingredients together makes this a very interesting and challenging area for theoretical modeling. And I should say that this kind of question applies to a whole range of physical systems where polariton condensation and lasing has been studied, ranging from organic crystals to organic polymers, biologically produced materials, and other small organic molecules. And I just put just a few examples of these here. So with that kind of broad outline, I just want to spend a moment talking about what kind of questions I think one would like to be able to answer with any theoretical approach in this area. And they are questions such as those which exist pretty much always for polariton physics of when you see a coherent state of light, should you describe it as condensation or lasing, or perhaps more interesting version of that question, which is how do you cross over between those regimes? Which regime better describes an experiment under particular circumstances? How well does it thermalize? What is the effect as you go between weak and strong light matter coupling? What's the nature of the phase transition? What do you see in terms of dynamics? And as I'm sure a lot of people are also interested, how does this strong coupling affect any kinetics that the molecules might have of chemical reactions? And then specific to organic materials, there are questions about the role of the vibrational spectra, of higher electronic states, of things which might affect the quantum yield. How does all of that affect the strong coupling phenomenon? And so with those kinds of questions in mind, what becomes necessary is to think of a model where you have photons and excitons and the degrees of freedom which make the complex molecular spectra, and you combine this with dissipation and pumping and want to try and put all of this together. And so this is really what motivates what I'm going to go on to talk about. And the outline of the rest of the talk is as follows. I think I've already outlined what it is we want to do, and I'll then go on to talk about what we can do, what methods already exist and their various merits and issues. And then connect this to the general question of non-Markovian open quantum systems. And then the middle of the talk, the main body of the talk, will really be discussing the tempo algorithm and its relation to an object called the process tensor. So this will be a quite theoretical section. And then I will end by talking about how this can be applied to modeling molecular polaritons. And if I have time at the end, I will also mention a couple of other things that we've recently done as extensions to the tempo algorithm and mention them in terms of things that then might later be connected to the physics of molecular polaritons. So to start with what we can do, I will start at what I think is probably the simplest level, which is to say a really simple approach you might take is to describe the system through something like the Dickey model or Tavis-Cummings model of a photon mode coupled to many two-level systems, which I've written here with Pauli matrices, sigma, and then to describe everything else through some kind of Lindblad dissipation processor, so photon loss. And then here I have written a rather crude approximation where all of the vibrational dissipation, all of the effects the vibrational modes do, get absorbed into just one number, gamma z. And in principle, such an approach would work if you could assume that the coupling to the vibrational modes was weak and that the bar spectrum, the spectrum of the vibrational modes had no discernible structure. So these are basically the ingredients you would need for the Born-Markov approximation. And I should also note that to have this really as some kind of fixed rate gamma z, you also need to assume that the strong coupling between light and matter does not significantly affect these. And so this is a very crude approximation, but it's probably the simplest thing one could start by doing. If I want to go a bit beyond that and perhaps say, how does strong light matter coupling affect these dissipative processes, then I could do something like Redfield theory. So Redfield theory is really how you would go about deriving these kinds of Lindblad dissipation terms in an open quantum system. But in general, it says something a bit more complicated than that. It says that you get this dissipation by figuring out the following object, which is what happens if you take the time evolution of the operator of the system which couples to the vibrational modes and convolve it with a Barth correlation function. So if you know how to calculate these things, if you know what the Barth correlation is, so what Barth spectrum is, and you know the time evolution of sigma z, including strong light matter coupling, then you can get a kind of improvement on this rather crude Lindblad dissipation. And something like this was done in this paper in 2015 by a group of Johannes Feist, looking at vibrational polaritons and looking at the effect of Barths on that. What I should note about this approach is that evaluating this object here is really quite difficult in general. And where you can really do that is if you have weakly interacting bosonic modes of your polariton, so you don't have to worry about any saturation of the two-level systems. Beyond that, it becomes very difficult to start evaluating that. And it can be done in various ways, but at that point, you also face the fact that this is still a kind of Markovian description. It's still time local. It doesn't capture all of the non-Markovian physics that a Barth might provide. So another approach you might take is to say, well, let me not consider the vibrational mode as just being a Barth. Let me instead take a vibrational mode of the molecules and put that into my system Hamiltonian. And that is the idea which leads to this thing that's been referred to by a few names, but is often called the Holstein-Tevis-Cummings model or Holstein-Dickey model, where I have a single vibrational mode that I have coupled into the system Hamiltonian, and I have the kind of standard displacement coupling between the electronic state and displacement of this harmonic oscillator. And I've drawn here a picture in the case where I have a single photon mode, that this describes something where you'd very naturally think of mean field theory, where I have a common photon mode that couples to the electronic state, and that in turn couples to the vibrational state. And this kind of approach has been used in lots of papers. I don't think this list is anything like up to date, but I ran out of space at the bottom of the slide. Just to mention a couple of things that we have done with this. We have looked at this in a mean field approach and mapped out a phase diagram to ask how does strong light matter coupling modify the threshold for seeing lasing. And then we've gone to an approach where we take more than one photon mode and look at the multimode physics of this with a cumulant approach and ask questions there about thermalization and about which polariton mode lasers. But that Holstein-Tevis-Cummings model is still limited in a couple of ways. It's still it just includes typically one vibrational mode. You could extend it to a few, but it becomes challenging the more modes you try and put into the system. And it's still a rather crude approximation of how those vibrational modes relax. There is no straightforward way of asking how strong light matter coupling affects the coupling to vibrational modes and therefore affects the relaxation of those modes. You get back to the same problem of how to derive a red field theory. What you would really like to do is to put in all the vibrational modes and have them all there in thermal equilibrium, so all the modes that couple to a given molecule, and describe this by the full vibrational spectrum of the molecule. And this has been done in a couple of, I think, very significant papers by the group of Johannes Feist in collaboration with Alex Chin, building on a model or on a method developed by Alex Chin, Martin Planio, and collaborators, which I'll just talk about very, very briefly here, which is to say, you can, in general, rewrite a Barth of harmonic oscillators which couples to a single electronic system as a chain of harmonic oscillators. And once you do that, you can then say that this is a problem that is straightforward to time evolve by standard matrix product state methods. And this approach is known sometimes as TDOPA, time evolution of density matrices, using orthogonal polynomials. The orthogonal polynomial bit is how you rewrite this Barth into a chain of harmonic oscillators. And in these papers, it was possible to study this up to 16 molecules coupled to this problem. But what you can see is that the more molecules you put in, the more complicated this is going to get. And so it will be certainly challenging to go from this to really 10 to the 3, 10 to the 5 molecules in a cavity and put in all of that physics. So let me pause at this point and just summarize what I've said so far about what you might do before going on to talk about this in the language of non-Markovian open quantum systems. The Lindblad approach has the advantage that it's very straightforward, but it ignores the structure of the bath, it ignores a lot of effects of strong coupling. Redfield theory may be able to correct some of those, but it has the problem that you need to know all the eigenstates of the system, and it's still Markovian in various senses. The Holstein-Tavis-Cummings approach helps to capture a lot of the physics of how light matter coupling competes with coupling to vibrational modes, but it's typically limited to a few vibrational states. And I also mentioned this point, but it is limited about how you might describe the damping of those vibrational modes you put into your system. Then non-Markovian methods are great because they capture all of the physics, but they can become numerically costly and may be restricted to a few molecules. And I've mentioned Tadopa because that's what's been applied to this kind of problem, but I think the same statements also apply if you would use other non-Markovian methods. So let's switch gears slightly at this point and talk about non-Markovian open quantum systems in general, to make the connection between what I have just said and a much larger field of theoretical study at the moment of what happens when the Born-Markov approximation breaks down. So just to draw a cartoon of when the Born-Markov approximation is valid and you can describe things by Lindblad approaches, it's valid when your system has a line width which is narrow compared to the range of frequencies over which the Barth spectrum, which I plotted in red, varies. So if you have a picture like this, where your system samples the Barth at a frequency 1 and has a narrow line width compared to the scale on which this red line is varying, then this Lindblad approach is good and everything is great. But there are lots of reasons that can break down, and therefore you may need to go beyond the Markovian description. The perhaps simplest reason is, what if you need to sample the Barth at a variety of different frequencies? If your system has lots of frequencies and samples the Barth not just at one point, that I note you don't really need a full non-Markovian treatment for that. That's when Redfield theory really can be very useful for going beyond the simplest approach. But there are cases where even that will fail. So if your coupling to the Barth is strong, as may be relevant in the case of organic molecules and the coupling to vibrational states of the molecule, then this line width is no longer narrow and you start to sample the Barth over a range of frequencies, and at that point, a Markovian description will fail. If you have strong coupling in your system and your collective mode frequencies go near to 0, your Barth spectrum almost certainly has some significant frequency dependence near 0 frequency, and so a Markovian approximation will fail. If your Barth has a lot of structure, as is often typically the case for vibrational modes, then again, Markovian approaches will fail. And I also mentioned before, the difficulty of Redfield theory is that it requires you to know the system eigenstates. And if you don't know those, then doing something like, some form of non-Markovian treatment would be necessary to get past that problem. So these are all things which can happen in a variety of systems, not just in molecular polaritonics. And so it's not surprising that this whole general field has quite a lot of literature about different approaches one can apply to such problems. And so let me mention a few things that have been done in this area. And there is a review of many of these things in RevModPhys from 2017 that talks about several of things I'm going to mention. To my mind, the whole field divides into two broad categories, which are the miscellaneous category that I'm going to put on this slide, and then the next slide where there's a much more systematic theme of how all the methods relate to each other. So my miscellaneous category includes a few things. it includes the fact, of course, there will be some problems which are non-Markovian, but which you can solve exactly. If everything is non-interacting harmonic oscillators, you can solve it all exactly, and that can be a great reference problem for comparing other methods to. The second miscellaneous thing I put here is there exist some problems where your original problem does not have a small parameter. There is no weak system Barth coupling, but there may be other weak parameters in the problem. There may be some term in your Hamiltonian which is small, and then there may be a polaron transformation you can make which turns your system Barth coupling into something you can again treat perturbatively. So this exists and can be useful in a lot of cases, but this is typically not true if I'm talking about strong light matter coupling and strong coupling to vibrational modes. My third miscellaneous thing is there exist various approaches of things like diagrammatic quantum Monte Carlo of resumming perturbation theory, which have been particularly useful in coupling to non-Markovian fermionic Barths. And I mention this here because it may well be a more broadly useful tool, but one which has so far only been applied in a few cases. Then the other broad category, I would say, is that everything else one wants to try and do, you can think of as a systematic way of augmenting how you describe your system. So there are approaches such as the hierarchical equation of motion approach, where you write a sequence of equations of motion which couple to higher order equations, and that puts more and more information about the Barth into your set of equations of motion. There are methods where you say that if your Barth has a structure with some resonant feature in it, you should take that resonant feature out of the Barth and put it into the system. So put a harmonic oscillator into your system, and that will give you a smoother Barth, and that will then make everything easier. So that's augmentation by putting degrees of freedom into the system. And of course, that is exactly what the Holstein-Tavis-Cummings model is doing. It's taking one vibrational mode out of the Barth and putting it in the system. You can do that sequentially. So take one mode out and then the next mode and then the next mode. And that is basically the idea that's behind the kind of chain mapping approaches involved in Tadopa and work by Alex Chin and Martin Plenio. So actually, two of the things I've already told you about are examples of this approach of taking modes out of the system, out of the Barth, and putting them into the system. And then the third category, which is really what the rest of this talk is going to be about, is methods where you augment your description of what is your system by keeping track of its history, not just its current state. And this is all approaches built on something known as the quasi-adiabatic propagator path integral, developed now a quarter of a century ago by Makary and Makarov. The key challenge, I think, with all of these methods is how well can you combine all of this with wanting to really study many-body physics? And this is something that we're very interested in the moment. And I'm going to tell you about an adaptation of the Quappy method, but I think is very powerful for going beyond small non-Markovian systems. And that's really what I want to say in the rest of this talk. So what I want to do next is to talk to you about the tempo algorithm and how it relates to the Quappy approach, and have a slight intermission where I talk about matrix product states to then say how this all fits together. So the Quappy approach is for problems involving a system coupled to a Barth of harmonic oscillators with this kind of linear coupling where the Barth is some set of harmonic oscillators. And the approach is based on the following. You proceed as if you were trying to write down a path integral to propagate the density matrix. And you do something slightly subtle, which is that when you normally write a path integral, you would write the resolution of identity in terms of integrals, hence why it's called a path integral. And you do that for the Barth, but for the system, I want to write it as a discrete sum over system states. Now, once I've done that, the key point is that I can exactly integrate out the Barth. if the bath is harmonic oscillators, I can perform all of the integrals over bath coordinates here. It's just a set of Gaussian integrals, and there exists a closed form for the result of doing all of those integrals. And that closed form I will write down here. Its particular details are not particularly important, but what it ends up saying is that the density matrix at the final time is related to the density matrix at the initial time with some sum over all intermediate states. And these intermediate states actually are kind of doubled in that they are both states of things to the left of the density matrix and to the right. So there's this picture of time propagating forwards and backwards, and these J's, these intermediate states I need to sum over, are two copies of the state of the system. And then there is this stuff here that I write as I, and really all that matters is to know that I know the content of I exactly. I know everything which goes into it, and all it depends on is the matrix elements of the operator O, which describes the system bath coupling between different states, and the correlation function of the bath. This is the same object that appeared a few slides ago in Redfield theory. If I know that, I know how to calculate these I's. Everything is known here, and in principle, I have an exact expression for the full time evolution of the system. So this looks incredibly powerful. What I therefore need to do is to evaluate this sum over all intermediate states. And what that means I have to do is to evaluate a sum over these indices J over all intermediate times of some high rank tensor, a tensor with many indices. And that tensor A, I have actually a straightforward way of figuring out what it is at each time step. It is related to the tensor of the previous time step by another tensor called the growth tensor B, which tells me how to go from one time step to the next. And all of this is known. The problem is that as you propagate forward in time, the tensor A grows exponentially. And so this means that in practice, just doing this in a brute force approach is pretty restrictive to the number of time steps you can propagate. You can probably get to 10, maybe 20 time steps. If you then apply some further tricks, you might get a bit further. But there is this significant problem that the tensor involved here grows exponentially. So what I want to do now is have a brief intermission and talk about matrix product states. Because as I'm sure many of you are aware, there has been a kind of quiet revolution in a lot of areas of theoretical physics in the last decade of thinking about things in terms of matrix product states. And the idea of a matrix product state is that if I have a tensor with many indices, a high rank tensor, it is often very good to write that as a product of matrices. So the picture is that for a particular pattern of the indices I1, I2, I3, that will give me a particular set of matrices A, and then I work out the value of T for that pattern of indices by just multiplying together these matrices. The matrices turn out to be vectors at the two ends, and that will give me a number. And the idea is that these matrices are of a certain size set by what is called a bond dimension, chi. And the key point is that if I can do that, the amount of information in this product of matrices is a sum over all of the indices from 1 up to n of d times the chi squareds. And if I think about for n sides, that is something which looks like it grows linearly with n, as opposed to this exponential growth. Now, of course, there is no free lunch here. This is not saying I can represent an exponential amount of information with a linear number of variables. What it is instead saying is that in very many cases where you thought you needed to write a high rank tensor, you do not need to write all possible high rank tensors. You only need to write ones which can be efficiently represented in this way. And this shows up in many contexts. It shows up in the wave functions of many site problems if you are interested in the low energy states of problems with local or at least short range interactions between sites. It shows up similarly in density matrices of problems with many sites. It shows up in lots of classical problems with probabilities with short range interactions. And the point in all of these examples is that the actual bit of state space that I need to represent is very well captured by these matrix product states. And once you have that idea, that key idea that maybe you don't need all possible tensors, you only need the tensors that are represented well by matrix product states, that gives you a whole range of things you can do. So there are lots of 4-letter acronyms in this field. There is DMRG, which basically means, let me make a variational guess of my wave function, but it is a matrix product state with a particular bond dimension, and then try to minimize. There is TEBD, which is time evolving block decimation, which is, let me say that I have my state as a matrix product state and I want to time evolve it. I can often write the propagator of the system, a time evolution, as a matrix product operator written in U. And I can do the time evolution by contracting this tensor network, which means squashing it down into one set of tensors with bigger indices here because I have 2 lines connecting each thing. And then the key trick of how do you then make this work efficiently is you go through and you combine these lines and you do what is called a singular value decomposition, and then you throw away all the small singular values and you get this back to an efficient representation. Then there are also approaches to going beyond one-dimensional problems, things called projected entangled pair states, yet more 4-letter acronyms. And there's a huge range of things you can build on this. So hopefully at this point, it's clear why I told you this, because the problem with QAPI is that you had this high rank tensor. And there is a very good reason to believe that this is in exactly the class I just talked about. But while it is a high rank tensor, I don't think I need to represent all possible high rank tensors, because these different tensor indices tell me about how much of the history many time steps ago influences the future. And what I think will typically be true is the further back you go in time, the less effect it will have on the future. The Markovian approximation is very brute force, and it says history has no effect on the future, but I can kind of systematically go beyond that by saying, well, maybe I need to go back 100 time steps, 1,000 time steps, and these things very far away will have a little effect on the future, but non-zero. And if that's true, then a matrix product state representation of A is going to be a really good way of compressing this problem. And once you start to do that, actually, you find that everything goes really well. You find that this B propagation tensor really is very well represented as a tensor network. And you find that what QAPI is really doing is taking this tensor network and contracting it. And the thing that we actually call tempo is an approach to contracting this by saying, suppose I can contract everything in the green box, and it then turns into this matrix product state representation of the augmented state of the system. Then the next thing I should do is contract the stuff in the green box with the stuff in the pink box. And actually, that's just a matrix product state, matrix product operator multiplication. It is a standard library call from a library for doing matrix product state stuff. So I don't need to reinvent anything. I can just apply this and I can keep on going. And in fact, if I know how to do that, I do know how to contract all the stuff in the green box, because that's just a special case of this MPS-MPO multiplication. And what you find when you do this is that you go from being able to do this with keeping a history of maybe 10 or 20 time steps to being able to do maybe 1,000 time steps instead. And so this hugely opens up what you can do. But it goes further. And it goes further because you can recognize something else that this tensor network is talking about, which is that all the information about your system shows up only in this diagonal. Only these green boxes, these tensors at the edge of the diagonal, care about the system Hamiltonian. Everything else depends only on the bath. And that's a very useful thing to observe, because it suggests, well, what if I contracted all of this stuff in blue? And if I do that, what I actually get is an object that is known by many names in the literature. I'm going to call it the process tensor, which is a name used by Felix Pollock and Kevin Modi in these papers. And this process tensor is a very useful object in principle, because it is an object which, if you know it, it tells you how to predict any sequence of operations on your system, any multi-time correlation, any sequence where you prepare a state, evolve, measure, or whatever you want to do. The process tensor tells you how to calculate that. But for a long time, it's been a kind of conceptual, abstract object, but if you knew it, you could do everything. But obviously, it's a high-rank tensor, and it's really hard to know it. But of course, the point is, you can represent this as a matrix product state. And moreover, if you have written down the tempo tensor network, you can contract this to a matrix product state representation of the process tensor. And why that is exceptionally powerful is you do this once for one bath. It depends on bath temperature and the bath spectrum, but once you've done that, I can repeatedly contract this with lots of system Hamiltonians at a relatively low computational cost. So as an example of doing that, there's a paper where we use this to do optimization by putting in lots of different time-dependent Hamiltonians and finding which one was best for preparing a state, with a full non-Markovian calculation done, in this case, in a few seconds in each case. Okay, so I have told you about tempo. What I want to now do is tell you about how to apply this to the problem of molecular polaritons. And so what I would like to be able to do is the same thing that was done with the Tadopa approach of looking at a problem which consists of a photon mode coupled to two-level systems, where each two-level system couples to its own bath, represented here by these lines at the edge. And I would like to do this in principle for many molecules. And what we're actually going to do here is to start from a limit of an infinite number of molecules, and then I hope in the future we'll work back from infinity towards a finite number, rather than starting from one and working upwards. And if I think of the limit where nm is very large, then I know that this topology of this problem really suggests applying mean field theory, because I have that the photon mode sees many molecules, and therefore fluctuations of what happens for each molecule will get washed out. And roughly the photon mode will see a mean field of the molecules, and the molecules will see the mean photon field. And what that means is I should replace this problem here by two self-consistently coupled problems. I should have one problem which is time evolved the average photon field due to the effect of nm molecules, where I should model each molecule exactly. And then the second problem is the one written out below, which is the time evolution of one molecule with all of its vibrational bath, etc., affected by a given coherent photon field. And this second problem is something which is exactly suited to a method like tempo, because I need to deal with a full non-Markovian bath of the vibrational spectra that the molecule sees. But I would like to do that for some arbitrary time-dependent photon field that I might see. And this method I've just described of pre-contract the process tensor and then use that allows me to do that straightforwardly. So this is work which we are writing up at the moment, done by a graduate student, Piper Fowler-Wright. And we've done this looking at a bath spectrum, which is ohmic, so a frequently used bath spectrum in the context of non-Markovian open quantum systems. We have adapted parameters so that it matches very well to the observed absorption spectra for BODIPI-BR. And we use this process tensor approach. And then this allows us to do individual simulations which take a matter of minutes to say what is the photon number as a function of time here with different pump strengths. And then I can go beyond that, and because it's relatively cheap to do each calculation, one can then say, well, what's the steady state photon number as a function of pump strength? for different cavity frequencies, and then you could start to map out phase diagrams of this non-Markovian problem. So what's the critical pump strength for condensation in this mean field theory as a function of cavity frequency, and you can see what cavity frequency is optimal, and then you can see how this varies as you change the coupling strength to light, and you see that when you're relatively weak coupling, you need a strong pumping, as we expect, but as you increase the coupling strength to light, the critical threshold does come down, but then saturates. And this is very similar to things we saw with the Holstein-Tafis-Cummings model, but now we can see that this is robust to going to a problem with a full arbitrary vibrational environment. And we can also more reliably answer questions about how things depend on temperature, because I'm no longer relying on Markovian descriptions of thermalization, so we can also map out what happens versus the temperature of the bath. Okay, so I have, I guess, a couple of minutes remaining, so I'm going to just talk about two other things which we have done with tempo or tempo-like things, which I think in the future might be applicable to molecular polaritonics, but as yet are separate from that. And the first of these is to say, while I've talked about non-Markovian environments, QAPI, and also to some extent most of the other non-Markovian methods around, do have a restriction, which is that they would like the environment to be Gaussian. They would like it to be a bath of harmonic oscillators, or maybe a bath of non-interacting fermions, something where it's Gaussian, so I'm able to integrate out the bath exactly. But when I start talking about process tensors, then what you can notice is that the process tensor definitely exists for any bath. There is no requirement for it to be Gaussian. This object exists no matter what bath you consider, no matter how complex it is. This object is there. Of course, the fact it's there is not that useful if I have no way to calculate it. There is a way in principle, but not in practice, of calculating it in all cases, which is to say, well, what it really involves is a sum over all the states of the bath, and all, in quotation marks, all I have to do is do an SVD and contract that to work out what the relevant degrees of freedom of the bath are. Now, that's impractical because this is a huge problem, and there's no way I could even write down the matrix or store the matrix, but I need to do the SVD of in the computer. But what we've explored in this paper by Moritz Sigarek et al. Is that there is a way to iteratively build up the description of the environment. So to try and pick out a discretized representation of the environment, and then incrementally add one mode of the bath at a time to these object Q that describe the matrix product state representation of the process tensor. And that approach does not rely on the bath being Gaussian. So when the bath is Gaussian, we have tempo, but when the bath is not Gaussian, we're a bit stuck. But this approach allows us to get beyond that. And we've looked at this with a variety of examples in this problem. So one example we looked at in that context is a bath of spins rather than a bath of harmonic oscillators. And another example, which we looked at more recently, is a bath of Morse oscillators, so anharmonic oscillators, perhaps much a more realistic description of vibrational modes of a molecule. And you can calculate the process tensor, and as the previous slides hopefully have made clear, if I know the process tensor, I can just lift that out of one calculation and put it into my description of the mean field theory of molecular polaritons. The last thing I want to tell you about is another way to go to kind of many body problems, which is to say, if I know this process tensor description, then I can also deal quite easily with problems where my Hamiltonian couples lots of systems together. And if my Hamiltonian, in fact, couples only nearest neighbors together, this is even easier. I can use what is known as a Trotter expansion to alternately act on one pair of sites and then the next, and so on. And this tensor network that I've just drawn is also something that's basically known in the context of tensor network algorithms. And so this allows us to really deal with fully non-Markovian problems of chains of coupled systems. So this is perhaps not so directly relevant to many polariton problems, but is something which we're exploring and also writing up right at the moment. Okay, so this concludes what I want to talk about. I just want to mention the people whose work I presented. The work on the Holstein-Tavis-Cummings model at the beginning is work done by a former graduate student, Artem Strashko, and the work on the cumulant expansion applied to that is work done by a current postdoc, Christine Arnedotter. The work on tempo and its extensions has all been done in collaboration with my colleague in St Andrews, Brendan Lovett. The original tempo algorithm we developed with a former graduate student, Aidan Strathern, a former postdoc, Peter Curtin, and a former PhD student, Danius Kilder, many of whom are still involved with various extensions of tempo. The application of tempo to molecular polaritons and to the mean field theory has been done by a current graduate student, Piper Fowler-Wright. The process tensor reformulation, so both applied to optimization problems and now being applied to chains of systems in 1D, has been done by another current graduate student, Gerald Fuchs. And the work on the alternate method of constructing a process tensor has been done by a postdoc in Heriot-Watt, Moritz Sigarek, working with a colleague, a faculty member in Heriot-Watt, Eric Gauger. So let me put up some pictures to remind you of the things I talked about, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Professor. So now let's move on to the questions. So we have several questions. First, Matt, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for the very nice talk. I have a question about just the extension of the tempo method to cases where you have many more molecules. So you showed an application where you combined the mean field theory and tempo to model this case where you have a single cavity mode coupled to many molecules. I was just wondering, how essential is the mean field theory in your application for making your calculation computationally feasible? And like if the mean field theory is essential, then how do you suggest extending this method to cases where you have like many cavity modes or highly disordered systems where maybe a mean field approach wouldn't be suitable?
Right. So I think an approach where you try to do the exact numerics with many molecules is unlikely to work. I don't know how many we could get to by a kind of brute force application. With Tadopa, the answer was 16. I would be surprised if our number was wildly different from that. I think there are methods that allow you to do kind of 1/nm expansions. So start from mean field theory and go back from the large n limit. Indeed, I talked about the cumulant method that we were able to do with Markovian approaches, and it's an interesting question whether you can do something similar here. Disorder is another interesting question. I don't think that forces you to give up on mean field theory, because the mean field aspect here is really the statement that I'm not trying to solve all the bits at once. So what I would have to do to go to disordered problems is solve many copies of this second problem and then sum them all together in the first bit. And that's quite feasible because of this process tensor approach. But once we know the process tensor, contracting with slightly different system Hamiltonians is straightforward. If you really had different environments, as in different temperatures of each molecule, that would make it harder, but even that would still be feasible. So the disorder, I think, is possible. And there are a few methods around for thinking of disordered problems with mean field approaches beyond just simulating every molecule. So there's a very badly named technique, and I'm going to forget, which I think are called stochastic mean field theory, and I don't think that's a helpful name for it. It's really about saying that when you have a distribution of energies and you have many systems, you don't really care what every single two-level system does individually. What you care is about the probability distribution of sigma plus or sigma minus that the photon field sees. And so there are methods where you can get away from having to simulate every molecule. So I'm forgetting the names of the people who developed that method. It's Hofstetter and someone else. We applied this to a problem with coupled cavity arrays about 8 years ago. I've not seen much done with it since, but I think that could be applied to disorder quite reasonably. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks for the detailed answer.
Okay, so maybe we can move on to the next question. What?
Oh, hello, Jonathan. Thank you for the very nice talk. I have some questions actually about this mean field decoupling. First of all, can you tell us what are the degrees of freedom that get decoupled in the large N limit? And
so what is really being decoupled is the assumption that there's no significant entanglement between the photon and the molecules, which is what you expect when there is one photon mode coupled to many molecules.
Sure. Okay, but then but then there is all this really complex web of dark states that who knows what they are doing. And I guess the question I want to ask you is, do these mean field approaches, are they valid for all initial conditions of the molecules? Like, say, if I start my excitation in a particular molecule and I want to watch what happens afterwards, can I still invoke these mean field approaches?
So my answer is generally yes. If we're the thing which the mean field approach relies on is there being many more molecules than photon modes.
Sure.
The strongest evidence I would give you for why this is still okay with all the dark states, etc., is the cases where we have compared such results to exact numerics, which is all done with Lindblad dissipation and simple dephasing. So that's work done with Peter Curtin. It was actually motivated by work in the context of cold atoms in cavities. But there we did work where we did, we used the fact that I'll go back to the slide which has what model we actually were looking at. We looked basically at this Dickey model plus Lindblad dissipation. And I realized there's a typo, but I forgot sigma Zi here. So why I bring this up is because as soon as you do that, you have a lot of the physics I think you're interested in about dark states, because these local dephasing terms couple the bright states and the dark states, okay?
Yes. Yes.
So what we know from that, looking at that model, is there is a way using permutation symmetry to simulate this relatively cheaply so that the effort goes polynomially in NM, not exponentially. This is a way that's been reinvented multiple times. I think once by Nathan Sharma, once by a group in Gilla. We reinvented it being unaware of other people doing it, and I probably missed multiple other times it got reinvented. So we can do some exact numerics up to about 100 systems. And then we compare that to mean field theory and to cumulant approaches. And the basic story that comes out is the cumulant approach matches the exact numerics over a wide range of n, and it approaches the mean field limit as n goes to infinity. And exactly how large n you need for the mean field to be good is dependent on parameters, but it does all line up. That mean field works in the n to infinity limit, the cumulants give you the 1/n corrections, and these then match up to the exact results. Now, doing all of that for the full model with tempo would be a challenge, but I'm not sure I see any physics reason to expect that the thing which worked in this simple case will break when the bath is more complex.
So just to summarize, are you saying that these mean field theories in the large n limit are valid despite the initial conditions of the dynamics, despite the initial density matrix of the system and the bath? Yeah,
I think they are valid for what the steady states of the system might be. If you prepare a state that cannot be well represented by mean field theory,
I guess that's my question. What does that mean? Like, which would be a state that would be not well represented by mean field theory?
If your photon and two-level systems are strongly entangled, if you can't write it as some kind of factorizable states, then it's not going to work. But then I think what you would equivalently find is that as the system evolves, it will get closer to something where mean field theory would work.
I see. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have a few more questions. So one question from the Q&A from Wen Chang Ying, which says, very nice talk, thank you. I was wondering, how do you generalize the theory beyond Gaussian environment? Did you apply the mean field approximation for the path to convert it back to Gaussian?
Right, so so the key trick to be able to go beyond Gaussian environments here is to be able to bring one mode of the bath in at a time. So in principle, what you would need is to find a way to construct this object Q with this one line to the left and one line to the right. And the key of this method, the key point of this method is, suppose you know what Q is for the first k-1 bath modes. Then what you can do is construct the effect of the kth bath mode, which is what's written in this B of k, and combine it with the other k-1 modes. And then there is a relatively cheap singular value decomposition to evaluate here. And then you keep on repeating this process. So there is one new limitation that shows up in this case, which is you need to be able to write your bath as a sequence of bath modes. So I could do this, for example, if my bath consisted of a set of anharmonic oscillators, and I can do this one anharmonic oscillator at a time. What I can't easily do with this is a problem where my bath consists of many modes which are all strongly interacting with each other and all coupled. Whether there is a more general method that allows you to get the process tensor in that case, I'm not sure. I know the process tensor exists. I just don't know whether I know how to calculate it or whether there is a low rank MPS representation of it.
Thank you. I think we are, it's time now, but do you have a couple of, I think there are a couple of questions. Do you have time to answer them?
Yeah.
We have.
I can't see the Q&A. Should I open that?
Yeah. Also, I think the person has raised their hand. So yes, you can go.
Yep.
Hi, I actually put it in questions and answers. Do you have any example of this approach you had, non-Markovian, and a Qtip website to play around with them?
So this link here to this GitHub repository will give you access to the Tempo library, and that contains in it a couple of examples that will show you it working. They are mostly the examples that we put in.
So I got it. So then don't. Okay.
And I should say at the moment this is separate from Qtip. We tried to make this as independent of other libraries as possible, just for ease of implementation. But it's fairly straightforward if you want to take the output of this and turn it into QTIP objects and then use QTIP stuff as well. So it's based on Python. It does rely on a library from Google for doing tensor network calculations because there's no point in reinventing the wheel.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
I think we have one last question from Stefan.
Hello. Thank you for the very interesting talk. About the tempo approach, if I understood correctly, you choose a time range for the process tensor. That is spanned by the process tensor in the remote past. So my question is, how do you choose that time range that's spanned by the process tensor? Do you have a convergence criterion, or can you make an educated guess based on the correlation time or the bandwidth of the path you're interested in?
So I think basically you've said it all, that you can make an educated guess based on the correlation time of wanting correlations to die off before this memory time. Essentially, there are 3 parameters in every time we run tempo, which we can make educated guesses for, but then we do have to play around with to see convergence. So what one parameter is the time step for the discretization, and generally you choose that to be short enough that it's smaller than the time scale on which any significant evolution is happening of the system, so controlled by the fastest time scales in the system. The second is this finite memory time, and as you say, we can think about the correlation time of the bath. You plot this correlation function and see when it's falling to 0. We've actually observed recently there are quite a few problems where it turns out that life can actually get easier if you make that correlation time very long. So sometimes it is good to keep very much longer correlation times than you might have thought, because of the subtlety about how sharp, there's a problem if you impose any effective sharp cutoff on the correlation function. So you sometimes it's better to increase that time rather than decrease it, and then your computation gets faster. The third parameter is one which I'm afraid is more at the moment a just adjust it until things are working parameter, which is when you're doing all of these contractions, there are lots of singular value decompositions, and then at each step you throw away the smallest singular values, and that definition of smallest is controlled by a parameter which we call the truncation parameter, and the value of that affects the accuracy of the simulation. And essentially what we have done so far is adjust that until the results are converged to the accuracy we would like. And in the documentation about the library, we have some suggestions of how you would start on that, but that's one which one does have to play with to some extent. And I'm afraid all of the parameters do interact with each other a bit. So if you make the memory time longer, you might change the precision and so on. Does that answer your question?
Yes, makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much.
Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, thank you, Professor Jonathan Keeling, for this wonderful talk. And thank you everyone for attending, and see you next month.